Chapter 16. The Father and the Fighter. Every fortnight, the most popular pastime of Morniport took place in a storehouse on the docks. Longshoremen, sailors, and merchants pitched in together to arrange benches, scatter sand on the floor, and erect ropes around a fighting ring. Fighters came from all over the island. Some were slaves brought by their masters. Others were freemen but were poor and hoped to change that through winning a big purse. The caliber of competitors varied, but Nicholas had been right. Vondales quickly made a name for himself, beating even the most seasoned fighters. What he lacked in training he compensated for with ferocity, and it was clear to Sade that his brother took a special joy in the violence of the ring. He was lightning quick, clear-eyed, and decisive against his opponents. The money mattered little to him. It was the release of violence and the thrill of survival that left his bloody mouth smiling at the end of each bout. The money did matter to the men who bet on him, and he soon made them so rich that they would salute him, 2 fingers raised like a V, whenever he entered the ring. Over time, he only grew stronger. Money paid for coaches and mentors. He was a young man coming into his physical prime, and many a former fighter or retired mercenary was eager to work with him. Sade grew his skills as well. With the one book of spells returned to them by Timos, he practiced his art daily, focusing on practical spells of weather, working such as calling the wind, clearing mist, and parting rain clouds. He practiced more dangerous spells as well, those that were said to be beyond weather workers' abilities. With great concentration, he could move an object, a ring or key, across a table, even if he lacked the precision to summon them to the palm of his hand. He could make a candle wick smolder and could even focus on a spot on his own hand and make it burn, as if it were beneath a magnifying glass on a sunny day. He still lacked the ability to call forth a flame outright. Those secrets were in the books Timos had destroyed, but it was no use to dwell on it. Sade told himself he could already do far more than even an average weather worker. Better simply to move forward and continue with what he did know. Nicholas was pleased with them and they enjoyed his favor. After many wins, Vondales had filled their coffers, making the guild richer than it had ever been. They trained new fighters and even recruited from the ranks of unemployed ex-soldiers who congregated around gambling halls and drinking taverns. With money came power and more choices. Talk of buying a shop that would serve as a cover for an above-ground lair came up frequently among Nicholas and his lieutenants. They even considered buying a skiff in order to smuggle goods into the city for sale on the black market. Some nights, Sade would not even sleep, drunk with excitement of how far they had come and their potential to do so much more. But it all came crashing down in a single incident, with one reckless death. The man fated to die was a slave owner. He was a large, powerfully built man, once a fighter himself, but time had shifted the thickness of his shoulders to his belly. His slave, however, was a young man in his 20s with flaxen hair, shoulders as wide as an axe handle and legs thick as tree trunks. He bore a striking resemblance to his owner, and Sade commented on as much to Nicholas. "Wouldn't be the first man to bed one of his slave girls and make a slave out of the bastard. Won't be the last either," Nicholas said. By the way the man preened over his slave, showing him off to the bettors and odds makers, Sade sensed that Nicholas was right. The man's pride was more than that of owner. It was that of a father, and here, away from his other slaves, he could show it. Sade felt a twist in his stomach he had not felt before during a match. It was fear. So far, Vondales had beat even larger foes, either with speed, cunning, or pure rage. But the scars on the slave's knuckles and face made it clear he was experienced. Sade settled down on a bench near the back of the hall, one where he could see, but not necessarily be noticed. He had not resorted to using his magic arts to help Vondales in the past, but he was certainly not against it if the need arose tonight. A breeze to whisk dirt into an opponent's eye might be all Vondales required to gain the upper hand. In the end, it was not needed. Vondales was outmatched in size, but he used it to his advantage, moving quickly in and out of the flaxen-haired slave's reach, ducking low to avoid his swings and stubbornly twisting out of his grapples. Vondales played a defensive match, and just when Slade was wondering how he would win a strike or two, he surprised even Sade by suddenly mounting the slave's shoulders and choke him into unconsciousness with his legs. The match was over that abruptly. The storehouse shook with cheers. Vondales had not been favored to win considering the slave's size, and for those who had been faithful to him, he had just won a grand payout. Those supporters lined the edge of the ring, cheering and clapping. Vondales on his bare back, the crowd was full of fingers held up in the shape of a V. But the slave owner, the father, was far less from a gracious loser. Sade caught eye of his burning expression of disappointment and knew something was wrong. The moment the father started across the ring towards Vondales, Sade leapt up off the bench and started to push his way through the celebrating crowd to his brother's side. Perhaps even Vondales had doubted himself, for he was enjoying the celebration more than usual, clasping the hands of his fervent supporters and shouting obscenities at those who had bet against him. His face was red with exertion, his body slick with sweat, and his smile of joy unrestrained. He did not see the slave's father or the bottle in his hand until it was too late. Sade shouted a warning, but it was lost in the noise of the crowd. The bottle broke over Vondales' head. Bright red blood appeared almost immediately, splattering across Vondales' shoulders and dripping down his torso. He staggered, but the fight was not gone from him. The father attacked again, this time swinging the broken shards at Vondales' neck. Vondales dodged just out of reach, shaking his head and blinking to ward off the dizziness from the blow. The room erupted into chaos. There were those who wanted to intervene for either side. Then there were those who simply wanted another fight, this one to the death, and they held back the others. Countless scuffles knocked over benches. Men were flung up against the ropes. Sade saw Nicholas strike another man with a pair of iron knuckles. Carter and Andre were by his side, throwing others out of their path as they tried to make their way to Vondales. Sade stood up on an overturned bench to keep his brother and his attacker in sight. There was no question now. All rules were off. Sade was prepared to use whatever spell or charm he could to aid his brother. But before he could, a spectator tumbled into him. Sade tottered over onto the floor, his concentration broken. All he could do was look through the legs of the gathered mob to see the father collecting himself for another foray. But he was too slow. Vondales had recovered. As if feeding on the violent energy around him, the demonic spirit that Sade had seen that day with Timos returned. Vondales' lip curled, his nostrils flared, and his eyes shone with hate. He flung himself across the ring, leapt into the air over the man's shoulder, and as he dove past, he grabbed hold of the man's head. Then, with the agility of an acrobat, he pivoted in the air, planted his feet against the small of the man's back, and using his whole body for torque, he twisted the man's neck. It was too loud to hear the crack of vertebrae, but it was clear from the way the body dropped that the man was dead. The room came to a standstill. A slave dying in the ring was not uncommon. It was a danger of the sport, but this was no slave. This was an owner, a freeman, not a fighter. And Vondales had just murdered him. Sade knew the silence that followed. It was a silence of fear, the same silence that had followed Timos' beating. It was the silence of a room terrified, a room turning against the very ferocity it had moments before cheered. A room that had called for violence, then recoiled from it when an established order was so blatantly overturned. A freeman killed by a lower-than-low gutter-snipe fighter. A slave owner murdered by the prize fighter. When the reality of it struck the men gathered in the room, it was suddenly unacceptable, out of bounds. If a fighter can murder one spectator, why not any spectator? Why not them? The thirst for violence remained, but now was directed at reestablishing justice. Vondales would have to pay. Sade scrambled to his feet, raised his arms, and spoke one of the few spells he knew well, calling the wind. A few words of conjuring, a word to bind the spell, and the enchantment came to life between his fingers, growing to a force he held within his palms for as long as he could, before he released it. A gale-force wind blasted through the confines of the storehouse, blowing up dust, shaking beams and rafters, and most importantly, extinguishing every torch, lantern, and candle. The room was plunged into darkness just as the first cries of "Punish him!" were ringing out. From memory, and by groping in the darkness, Sade stumbled forward, making a path to the ring where he had last seen his brother. His eyes began to adjust to the dark, and he was able to make out his brother's shape. Vondales was calling out his name. "I'm here!" Sade cried. They collapsed one another and struggled towards the exit. Vondales throwing, tossing, and beating anyone unfortunate enough to be in their path. In the light of the doorway, they saw Nicholas punching a fat merchant in the mouth, his brass knuckles knocking teeth out by the roots. They came to his side and soon had a path to the door. Outside, they paused for breath until they heard the cry, "Kingsmen coming!" Instincts took control as the sound of horse hooves on cobblestone echoed through the buildings. They darted into an alleyway and fled around the corner just as the blue-cloaked lawkeepers descended on the fighting hall. Nicholas led them through a series of narrow passageways until they emerged on an upward side street. They could hear the commotion at the hall. A pair of Kingsmen galloped past and Nicholas seemed to make a calculation in his mind. Sade noticed the guild's boss's eyes narrowing as they did the day they first met. Except this time what Nicholas saw was not potential, but rivals. Sade and Vondales had grown too powerful in the guild, and this was the opportunity to rid himself of them. "They are here!" he cried out to the passing Kingsmen. "The murderer and his accomplice here!" If they heard over the clamor of the hoof's beats, the Kingsmen did not stop. They were unconcerned with the shouts of a teenager. But Vondales was. Somewhere in the fighting, he had picked up a knife, which he now used to slice open Nicholas's neck. Blood poured out on them. They left the guild boss in the street, a slaughtered animal with his life pulling out around him, and used the tunnels to get back to the hideout. It was empty. Most of the children were out begging or thieving. The few girls left were doing laundry in the stream that bisected the room. "What are we doing here?" Vondales asked breathlessly, washing the knife in the stream at their feet. "We need to get my spell book." "Then what?" "I don't know yet." Sade looked around at the room, contemplating the order, the peace present that would soon be gone as the news of Nicholas's death spread. There would be a vacuum at the top. Rivals would fight for positions. Would it make sense, he wondered, for him and his brother to stay, to try to take control of the guild themselves? Carter stumbled in through a tunnel. His clothes were torn, his face scratched from fighting. "Sade, Vondales, where's Nicholas?" Vondales took 2 steps forward and slashed Carter's neck too. The girls across the room shrieked. Carter fell down gurgling. "Would you please think before you kill any more people?" Sade shouted. "Why are you suddenly worried about right and wrong?" "No," Sade said, his temper flaring. "Because it's messy. Haven't you realized people want justice and revenge? They will come looking for us." Vondales sheathed a knife and stepped over Carter's body. "I'm covered in blood. I'm changing my clothes. When I'm through, I hope you have a plan." Sade found his pallet on the floor, unwrapped the spellbook that he kept wrapped in his blankets, changed his own shirt, then shoved a few foodstuffs, water skins, and extra clothes into a satchel. Vondales returned, his bloody clothes replaced. "Well?" "We start again," Sade said. "We start over. Come on to the docks."